We'll give everyone just one more minute to join in and we'll get started. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll go ahead and get started now. I'm Dr. Tequila Brownie. I'm the CEO of TNTP. And I want to kick us off today by sort of grounding the conversation with a few comments. You know, in a time where our field is always in short supply of time, you don't always attend something like this unless you really think it matters to your work. And we appreciate and know from experience that instructional coherence is one of those challenges that you all know shows up every single day in classrooms, in your planning, in research, and in the daily lives of the children that we're serving. And it also shows up in the results that we're all trying to achieve. So before we dive in, I want to take just a minute to set a little context. Most of you know this, but I kind of have to do it. As you know, TNTP is a national nonprofit, and we were founded in 1997, and we have spent nearly 30 years building partnerships with schools, with district leaders, with state leaders, and policymakers all across the country. Now, I want to be clear, we are not an ivory tower where we produce research that sits on the shelf. We implement and work on the ground alongside educators and leaders just like you all on this call. And then we use what we learn to help shape and inform policy as well. Now, this cycle of research, practice, and policy is how we've earned trust at every level of the system and have been able to effect change for millions of young people in our nation. So at TNTP, we've just come out of our strategic planning process, though, where we forced ourselves to sit with some really hard questions about the state of K-12 today. Now, I want to be clear, we are very proud of the work that we have done at TNTP in partnership with you all for over 27 years. We've spent decades making sure that young people had access to opportunities that position them for success. But the question we're asking ourselves is access enough for their long-term success? What are students able to actually do when they leave us? And is it enough for what comes next for them? And if it's not, why not? And what does that mean for how we continue to evolve our work? The answer to those questions force us to confront some uncomfortable truths. Now, unfortunately, they didn't surprise us, and they didn't surprise many of our parents and students who are experiencing this every day. It didn't surprise us because our own research has been pointing us toward these truths for years. You all will remember in 2018, we published our groundbreaking report, The Opportunity Myth, where we found out that too many students lacked access to 4 basic resources that are associated with academic success: grade level work, strong instruction, high expectations, and deep engagement. And the field responded. Schools and educators all across the country went about the work to ensure that all kids had access to those 4 resources. But as we watched that work unfold, we continued to see something we couldn't ignore. Too many young people, especially young people growing up in poverty, still weren't achieving the economic and social mobility and security that education promises. They weren't moving into thriving adult lives. And so the truth was, access wasn't enough. That led us to our research in passive opportunity, where we identified 5 interconnected factors that drive economic security and mobility: a strong academic foundation, career-connected learning, social capital, personal support, and community and civic engagement. Now, we knew we needed to dig into all 5 of those areas, both separately, but also in tandem. And so in the Opportunity Makers, the next report, we dug into that first factor of a strong academic foundation. And what we found was that only 5% of schools in the entire nation, so that's just over 1,300 schools, had a proven track record of at least 10 years of helping kids catch up and catch back up to grade level. How were they doing that? I'm glad you asked. What they weren't doing was adding more programs. You've heard the notion of addition by subtraction. Those schools were creating three conditions: belonging, consistency, and ding ding, coherence. Every element of the student experience was working together and it was compounding over time. And so each of those studies that I just referenced, the opportunity myth, passive opportunity, opportunity makers, and now coherence by design, has continued to sharpen our focus. And each one has continued to point us towards a broad direction. And that direction is this: the social contract, the promise of an education, candidly is broken in our nation. The idea that if you work hard, get an education, and do everything right, the economy will make room for you. That's no longer reliably true, and certainly not for enough young people. And it's sad to say for those of us on this call, it is experiencing for students in poverty, but also students of middle class as well. So that's not a marginal problem, it's a pattern. And at some point, we have to be honest about what that pattern means. Two things are true here. Access absolutely still matters. It always will. So you will see us continue to do the hard work to make sure that more students have access. And the second truth, access by itself is no longer the bar. The real gap now is between access and capability. Now, what do I mean by capability? Capability is for the ability of a student to take what they know and use it to solve problems that don't come with an instructional manual, to make informed decisions about work and life, and to adapt when the circumstances demand it. So they have the skills, the agency to navigate life. Now, here's what makes the access capability gap especially hard to close. It compounds over time. When students fall behind grade level, what happens, which happens early, and as we know often in fragmented systems, they lose even more than content. They lose the very foundation that they need to prepare for what comes next. So the longer that that gap persists, the harder that it is to catch up. Now, falling behind is absolutely an academic problem, but it isn't only an academic problem. It's also a mobility problem. In many schools, students experience days that are filled with fragmentation, from their assignments being disconnected from standards, interventions that are disconnected from core instruction, and tools and initiatives that are layered on without any type of alignment. We ask our students to do the work, but we haven't built a system that works consistently to build anything. Instructional coherence is how we begin to change that. It's the discipline of aligning everything that students experience, what they're asked to do, what their teachers are supported to deliver, and what the system prioritizes. So it consistently builds knowledge and capability over time. I want to close with this. Coherence is not optional, people. It is the work. And that's what today is about. I am so excited that you joined us. I thank you for trusting us to take this journey with us. And I thank you for all of the work that you do each and every day for the young people in this nation. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Devon Gadow. She's our Vice President of National Consulting at TNTP. Over to you, Devon.
Thanks so much, Tequila. Appreciate that, and just deeply appreciate your leadership in this work. As Tequila mentioned, I'm Devon Gadow. I'm Vice President for National Consulting here at TNTP, and I am thrilled to be with you today as member of the team that crafted Coherence by Design and moderator of this panel. I know that you are here to learn from our incredible panelists, and so we'll jump right in with introductions and get started. Today, we're joined by Dr. Erin Phillips. Erin serves as Knox County Schools as the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning. Throughout her career, she's held many positions within public education establishments, including Director of Curriculum and Instruction, elementary executive principal, elementary assistant principal, an academic coach, and elementary teacher. She's also served the Tennessee Department of Education as a literacy consultant and continues to partner with external organizations to improve literacy outcomes for all students, including TNTP. You may have also seen her in recent CCSSO videos about Coherence. She's done an incredible amount of work to bring this work to the fields. Erin is also joined by Amy Cox, an instructional coach at Pleasant Ridge Elementary School, a Title I school in Knox County, Tennessee. Amy holds a master's degree in curriculum and instruction and a graduate certificate as a literacy specialist. With a strong background in literacy and high impact instructional practices, Amy partners with teachers to strengthen Tier 1 instruction, analyze student data, and design targeted interventions that ensure every learner is both supported and challenged. Amy is one of those rare and wonderful individuals who, when we started talking about doing this webinar, was like, I'm really happy with the work that I'm doing direct in schools. And so we're incredibly grateful to have her here today. Nick Denton-Brown is a director at TNTP and has supported the Knox County team in this work. He's been with TNTP since 2011 and supported numerous districts to improve early literacy instruction. Nick and I worked together on the research team that produced the Opportunity Myth, exploring why so many students graduate from school unprepared for the lives they want to lead. And he now serves as TNTP's Instructional Coherence Practice Lead, where he supports systems to align the many supports they provide to students to ensure all learning spaces work together to advance students to access and participate with grade level content. In just a minute, I'm going to pass it off to Nick, who is going to share a little bit more about the report itself and what we found in our work in Knox County. As we get started, I just want to name a couple of housekeeping items. The first is that we will try to save time at the end of the session for audience Q&A. The Q&A feature will be open throughout the session, so if you do have questions for our panelists, please drop them there. And if any questions are not answered, we will get you those answers after the session through the email that we'll send. That email will also include both the slide deck and the recording, so no need to screenshot or take pictures of your screen if you are sort of looking at the slides of the results. So with that, we will hand it over to Nick, who's going to give us some high-level information on the findings from the report before we jump in with our panel.
Yeah, thank you, Devon. I think it will come as no surprise to many folks on this call that achievement gaps in this country between our highest and lowest performing kids have always been substantial, but they're actually now larger than at any point in recent history. And so that means that our lowest performing kids are falling further and further behind. What's eye-opening, though, is that this is all happening while states and school systems have been throwing resources and attention at this problem since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, when addressing learning loss became a major priority for systems all over the country. So the obvious question here is, why is this happening? Well, at TNTP, we get to observe instruction all over the country across many different schools. And we are seeing trends emerge in the ways that systems are supporting their struggling students. And I think the example you see here on this slide is a pretty common one. So here we have a fifth grade student, Anna, who is below grade level in literacy. And because she's behind, she is receiving various supports, including intervention, tutoring, and multilingual supports. But as you can see here, none of these supports connect, right? The puzzle pieces don't fit together. Nothing she is doing in these various spaces is helping her to be more successful in her core learning in her fifth grade class, where they are reading the Phantom Tollbooth. When she goes to intervention, she is reading a below grade level text on an entirely separate topic. In tutoring, she is practicing identifying sight words. In her multilingual supports, again, working on an entirely disconnected skill with a different topic and text. And common experiences like these mean that instead of building on a common foundation for kids, we are throwing different instructional programs that follow different sequences of learning at our highest need kids, and then asking them to make sense of these disjointed learning experiences. And this sort of instructional incoherence has profound impacts for students. The data you see here on this slide comes from a 2023 study we conducted looking at how students across 4 districts in Tennessee grew based on the type of supports that they received. So the first column in this chart shows you student performance on the beginning of year universal screener assessment that all kids in these districts were given. And now we're only looking at those students who are in the bottom 10th and 11th to 25th percentiles, right? The lowest performing kids in these districts. Typically, when you score at these ranges, you are identified for intervention. But that doesn't mean you always receive it. In fact, in many schools, there are too many students who qualify for intervention to actually be served. And so we have a sample here where we have similarly low performing students, some of whom received intervention and some of whom did not. And so what you see here is the growth of students who only got core literacy instruction compared to those who got core literacy instruction and tier 3 intervention. The thing that immediately jumps out here is that students were better off getting only core literacy instruction than getting both core instruction and tier 3 intervention. Right? Let that sink in for a second. The lowest performing students were better off getting nothing than going to tier 3 intervention, the most intensive form of intervention available. So we're going to hear from our friends at Knox County in just a second about how they led the charge to address some of these challenges around instructional coherence. But I very quickly want to paint a picture of what their intervention system used to look like, and then some of the shifts they made to align all of their various student supports to what was happening in that tier core classroom. So they really created a truly instructionally coherent model of student support in which all the puzzle pieces actually fit together. So in Knox's prior intervention model, they, like many systems around the country, were very reliant on universal screeners as the primary tool for flagging students for intervention. Now, these screeners are usually very, very good tools for identifying kids who are at risk and need more support, but they don't always tell us why kids are struggling and what they need to catch up. This problem is then compounded by what happens once kids get into intervention spaces, where in Knox, like in many places, every single tier of support was using a different instructional program. So again, instead of building on that foundation for kids and using a program they were already familiar with, we are throwing yet new programs and new sequences of learning at kids and asking our highest need students to make sense of these very disjointed experiences. The third big common challenge that we saw in Knox County was that instructors across tiers only had 30 minutes a month to come together to collaborate. And the only data they had to inform these sessions was oral reading fluency data, which again is a good indicator of challenge, but doesn't necessarily tell us why kids are struggling and what they need to become stronger readers. So, three big challenges. Knox made three big shifts to address those challenges. First, they started to diagnose and group students by their specific needs, not just these arbitrary cutoffs. So Knox County began to use curriculum-embedded diagnostics alongside screeners that could really home in on the specific needs and gaps that students had. And then they grouped students by those shared needs instead of these arbitrary tier 2 or tier 3 cutoffs. Second, Knox started to use aligned high-quality curriculum across all support spaces and tiers. So again, they're now building on that foundation kids are familiar with and not just throwing new and separate programs at students. And then third, they began to track more meaningful data. So instead of just relying on oral reading fluency data, Knox County began to track student performance toward the actual skills that students have been grouped for. And so teachers across tiers could go into these shared trackers and see how students were progressing in real time, and then use that data to inform their ongoing instruction, whether that was in tier 1 or an intervention. These shifts had a profound impact for kids. As you'll see here on this next slide, we had an outside partner come in and conduct a random control trial study. And what they found was that students who are in the coherent intervention groups averaged 1.3 additional months of learning compared to similarly performing peers who are in control intervention groups using Knox's prior model. These gains were even more profound for the lowest performing students in the study. Those in the bottom 10% actually grew by almost 2 additional months of learning. One of the schools in this pilot study actually reduced the number of students who were identified for intervention by 37% in a single year, right? Truly profound changes for these students. So with that bit of context set, I want to kick it back over to Devon so we can open up the panel and hear from the real superstars over at Knox County who led this huge effort in change management. So Devon, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. I know everyone is eager to hear from the Knox County team. As a reminder, the Q&A box is open, so please drop questions that you have for them. But I have a couple that will get us started. So first, Amy, I think we can probably start with you at the school level and then have Erin sort of layer on the systems components. But what were some early signals that told you that the intervention approach that you were using, while well-intentioned, wasn't producing the learning gains that you all were hoping for in Knox County?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest signals for us was, as you kind of mentioned, that inconsistency in student outcomes, even though teachers were working incredibly hard as they do. And we had built in, multiple layers of support, but it just wasn't translating into the classroom the way that we intended. And then we saw students who are carrying this huge, high cognitive load, trying to navigate different expectations, different language, routines, and skills across their day. And it just made it difficult for them to connect their learning and to kind of jump into tier one instruction. So it really pushed us to step back and recognize that while the effort was definitely there, the system itself just wasn't aligned in a way that could truly support student learning. And it just felt really obvious when we first started this work.
Yeah, Devon, just to layer on that district lens, we had years and years of data that indicated that we had students who were receiving intervention services every year of their educational career. They were intervention lifers, which was never the intention of the RTI process to begin with, but that's what was happening. Stacked and stacked data that said what we were doing was not closing academic gaps. And the student experience was that of disconnection and confusion when they were exiting their tier one classroom and receiving support. That support was not on the same thing that they were learning in tier one. It was on a completely different skill, using completely different academic terminology and completely different visual aids and resources. And then when they would return to tier one, they had no idea that what was going on and still expected to meet those tier one expectations. So our students' experience is what drove us to take a deep look at what we could do differently. Obviously, our data indicated what the work that we were doing was not making a significant positive impact on student learning. And that led us to really have conversations about what we've been talking about, referring to as the opportunity tax. So, what we were doing in intervention was using evidence-based instructional resources. Well, the quality of material that we had was high. We had very high quality material backed by research and science of reading, all of the bells and whistles, if you will, to say that the materials we were using were of good quality. However, the success of that quality intervention really depends on the degree of fragmentation from tier one. And so if you were to take this high quality material and divide it by the degree of fragmentation, that ends up equaling the success of the intervention or of the effectiveness. And even though these materials were high quality, they were so disconnected from tier one. We weren't following the same systematic scope and sequence. We were not using the same academic terminology. And to Amy's point, we were asking some of our most at-risk students to carry the heaviest cognitive load and transfer knowledge of multiple skills in every educational environment. And that was the challenge that we were seeing that led us to dig deep.
Thanks so much, y'all. Appreciate those reflections. I think what's interesting, right, Amy, as I heard you say, like it was so obvious once we started digging in, right? And Nick talked a little bit about the shifts that you all made. Prior though, right, like there was this very common experience, right, in the district where there was this fragmentation, heavy reliance on universal screeners, disconnected programs, insufficient time and data for collaboration. We also know it was never your intention, and it's often not systems' intention to end up in that place. Can y'all share a little bit about how this system came to be? Like, how did you get there in the first place that led you to have this epiphany?
I think as a state, And as a district leader, we rely on our state to provide us with guidance around how to serve students. And our state department relies on our legislators to guide that process too. And so, as a state, we had guidance documents that were lengthy, very robust in narrative format, that often sparked heated debate around what was required versus recommended. Um, and for a long time within that resource, this conversation of, or this idea of students who don't reach success or high levels of mastery in tier one must need something different in order to reach that high level of success and mastery, was what led us here. We have a long time of guidance that says, hey, if it's not working this way in tier one, try something different with this different resource. And years compounded upon years has led us to the place where we had lots of resources out in schools being used for tier two or tier three services, and even beyond that in ELL and special education.
And Aaron, I think that point you made about students needing something different, right, from in intervention from what they're using in tier one, that might have actually been true 10 years ago, before we had a lot of the high quality curricular materials we have available to us today. But I think policy has to catch up to the ecosystem we're now in. We actually have really good materials, good curricula, good diagnostics that we can use that are transferable across learning spaces. But I think we're still seeing messages come, right, from different state departments, explicitly or implicitly, that instruction has to look very different in intervention than what it looks like, in that core learning space. And so we see states put out parallel approved curriculum adoption lists, right? That says, here's one set you can adopt from for tier one, here's one set for intervention. And so I think that's sending the message that these things are disconnected and separate and should be treated so. Whereas in fact, we should look at these, I think, more coherently as a cohesive whole.
Yeah, I appreciate that broad context and historical context, Nick. So we know the shifts you made from the paper from the beginning of the webinar. Erin, can you speak a little to the systems level changes that you had to enact in order to support these shifts and new approach? And then Amy, maybe if you would add on, like, what did you do to reinforce that at the school level?
Absolutely. So, part of the systems level change was asking people to do some work, really digging in and explaining why I was asking them to do these assessments. So, Nick mentioned earlier that part of the shifts we made was not only depending upon that universal reading screener, but really requiring our teachers to administer a curriculum embedded diagnostic assessment that enabled us to pinpoint a student's first point of error so that we could more strategically intervene and not just place a student in tier two and every student in tier two in that grade level received the exact same support in the exact same starting place and then paced out their learning in the exact same way. That wasn't getting us where we needed to be. And so we had to back up and say, do we have the right information? Do we have enough information in order to best serve students through the intervention process? And I will be completely honest with you. At the beginning of the year, we heard grumbling. We had some teachers not understanding or not very happy about having to administer an additional assessment. However, those grumbles stopped rather quickly, I might say, because as soon as teachers gained this information, we started hearing comments like, I don't know that I've ever known this much about my students this early in the year before. I know more about how to help this student in tier one and during intervention. And it quickly became a win. So the very first thing was we had to ask some people to do some things. They weren't all thrilled, but once they started doing it, they found value in it. And so kind of shifting this philosophy of, hey, you know what? I got to generate buy-in first to, no, I need people to try in and then I'll gain their buy-in. So really shifting that narrative a little bit. The other thing that I've really leaned into over my time here in Knox County is being vulnerable as a leader and living in the learning space. being completely transparent with our principals, with our instructional coaches like Amy, with teachers that I talk to about how I don't know everything. I don't know it all. And in fact, as a leader in education, I'm obligated to learn more about what works well for students. And so, in order to do that, I need schools like Pleasant Ridge to come on board with me and say, you know what, we're willing to dig in and learn with you. We know we might not get it right immediately, but we're going to problem solve throughout all of the hardships that come with this learning experience. And on the end of it, we're going to know what works better for students. And so that has been one of my biggest missions is partnering with schools to do the work rather than doing it for them or to them. As a leader in this district, demonstrating my want, my desire, but also my willingness to walk alongside them in learning and be willing to say when I screwed up, right? I'm going to make mistakes as a learner and I'm not always going to get it right. People trust me because I'm also willing to say, didn't get it right this time. Here's what I learned from that mistake. Now here's what we're going to do to fix it. So I think that's a huge part of leading this work as a district leader. I would say that the next part of that is just being really transparent with my expectations and why I have those expectations. We talked about history being really grounded in that universal reading screener and how that was the end all be all black and white. If a child scored 25th percentile and below, automatically meant they were going to get an intervention. We had those bands of service, and it was easy to depend on the black and white. Well, here I come with a big fat wrench and say, no, we cannot just do black and white, guys. We got to live in the gray. We need to dig deep and know, what do students know? What do they not know? But we also need to align that to our tier 1 systematic scope and sequence to actually truly be able to say whether that's a deficit or we just haven't been taught that yet. Right? So sometimes we live in this space of they need intervention, but in reality, we haven't been taught the information yet. So digging deep and saying to people, no longer can we just make decisions regarding intervention placement based on universal reading screeners. With that, I'd love to kick it over to Amy so that she can talk about the school level perspective of some of those system level changes.
Right. So very similarly, how you were saying that you were a learner with schools. Well, in the building, I was a learner with teachers and students. There was definitely a learning curve, and we were asking our teachers to do things differently. And we know change is hard. And at first, it was kind of hesitant to change and do something different. Is this really the work we should be doing? What is this? And why are we doing it? But when we started digging into the data, that's really when we began to see these things shift. Teachers were seeing themselves that they had, the data to do what they needed to do with students in their classroom. They could see that they had a much clearer understanding of what their students actually needed, and not just that there was a gap, but where do I start instruction? So, I'm not going to stick a child in a group if I don't know why they're going into that group, just because of, a piece of data somebody handed to me. Our teachers were, hands in the work immediately. Like I said, it was a lot of work, but it was so worth it. And when teachers started seeing what was coming out of this, their confidence grew. They were excited themselves because they were understanding what this process was. And it really was a try-in before a buy-in, like Erin had said. And, we're still learning and growing through this process, and we do make mistakes, but now we know that we're making the right kind of mistakes. They're helping us build greater clarity and consistency across our classrooms. And again, like I said, once teachers start to see that alignment and the impact that it was having on students and that it has, that's when that confidence really grew and the commitment to the work really start to grow.
Thanks, Amy. I think y'all over in Knox County need to trademark "try in before you buy in," because that's a really good one that we should stick with. Amy, to your point about sort of some of the work that you did on campuses and what folks started to see to build that buy-in, can you share a little bit about what the coherence work started to look like in practice in your building once the changes were underway?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the building, this really shifted for us from a focus on remediation to acceleration. Students were now working on the same skills. They were using the same language and following the same expectations across tier 1 and intervention. We really anchored everything out of tier 1. As Erin said earlier, some of the skills that we were seeing in our data, some of it was just they hadn't been taught yet. And so we weren't, again, just sticking them in a group and hoping that skill would pop up somewhere. We were really able to really target skills that we were seeing were either lacking or, again, not taught yet. Our PLCs actually became more focused, and teachers didn't feel like they had to constantly reteach when kids would come back in their classroom. They were able to build directly on what they were learning in tier 1 in intervention. Our PLC language became the same. We learned together. A big part of this was just helping teachers understand, what does this actually look like in the classroom, and why does it matter? So it's been a great process. And once we started really digging into the data, like I said earlier, that's when we could see what students really needed and bringing out that clarity. And one way I like to describe it is that it reminds me of a jigsaw puzzle. And if we think about our tier 1 instruction and how that's the big picture, right? That's the jigsaw puzzle that we're creating. But what we had was students were going to different locations and getting different pieces of a different puzzle. And then they're coming back into tier 1 and they're trying to help put this big puzzle together, and they don't even see the big picture. The language was different. The picture is different. So when we started doing this work, we noticed that those students who need the most support were getting the right puzzle pieces. They were bringing it back to the classroom excited and able to really be involved. And so it was a huge shift for us that we're here because of students, right? And so to see their confidence grow, to see their skills grow, and to do this work with them, that was really what helped us connect all this learning. They were more confident. Teachers feel much more confident. They don't feel like, honestly, some of their load is taken off as well, because they're not having to reteach skills or reteach vocabulary to the students that are coming back in their classroom. So it really simplified things for them and students.
I love that puzzle piece analogy, Amy, and also love the connection, right, between like creating a coherent student experience and student sense of, confidence, belonging, right? Like those things are intricately connected. You all saw that on the ground. We also saw that in opportunity makers. So I think it's a really important point as we continue to have this conversation in the field. Let's talk about outcomes. So what were some of we talked about sort of what you all saw in the broader study, but what were some of the early outcomes or indicators that told you that this new approach was working for students?
So Nick mentioned some of our quantitative outcomes from the study, which we're thrilled with, learning that our students who were experiencing coherent support gained additional months of learning compared to those not receiving coherent support. But beyond that, what the report doesn't talk about is the data on the diagnostic assessment. And so that diagnostic assessment aligns with our curriculum, meaning it aligns with the systematic scope and sequence that our students learn foundational literacy. And what we've learned by looking at that data carefully, periodically throughout the year, is that of what teachers have taught explicitly, we have more rates of student mastery than we've ever had before. I had a principal tell me not long ago, actually, that, and mind you, at the beginning of the year, her kindergarten teachers wanted to do alphabet boot camp for 4 weeks at the beginning of the year. And it took lots of persuasion not to let that happen. And we fought tooth and nail about it. And they ultimately, went along with the program and stuck with the high quality instructional material and stuck with the scope and sequence. And just a few months ago, those teachers said, you know what? I have more kids who have mastered what I've taught than I've ever had before. This is working. And so that's huge. I think that's a huge testament to one, the fact that there are some challenges present with getting this off the ground and running, but stick to your guns, stick to what you know is impactful. And again, this trying to buy in phrase that I can't coin because I learned it somewhere. So, Devon, while I would love to coin that, I cannot. But it's so relevant that when we have teachers who try things out with students and see the impact that it makes, both quantitatively and qualitatively in the classroom, they're more likely to continue with that practice. And so many students were mastering those skills. One of my favorite stories to tell about this is listening to students. And so I was observing a classroom, a small group intervention. A little friend walked in. The teacher sits down with the students and tells them what they're going to be learning about. And he lit up. I mean, his eyes grew big. His face was just this wide smile. And he was like, I already know that. We just did this in tier one. I can tell you all about it. I can do that. And so, like, this self-efficacy from the student perspective was such a pleasure to witness. And his sense of belonging and connectedness to what was being done, not only in his tier one environment, but what he was being supported with in a small group learning space, was so evident that his free, expression of that really spoke to the qualitative evidence collection of the value of this work. So super, super important that we see that student self-efficacy be demonstrated across service being provided.
And yeah, if I can just jump in quickly, we talk about, some of the student outcomes, but I think and both Amy and Erin alluded to this, but teachers themselves actually preferred this new model. During the pilot, we actually surveyed teachers, and those who had used both the old model and the new coherent approach to intervention preferred the new approach by like a 4-to-1 ratio. It was pretty dramatic. And if you look at some of the open response comments from the survey, yeah, they loved how closely it aligned to the tier one materials. They loved that they could see the specific needs that students had and could really sort of target those needs. So once teachers themselves saw coherent intervention in action, they did not want to go back.
Amy, anything that you would add? Any other fun
Yeah, I was just thinking while Erin was talking about that student experience and the joy and the excitement, and especially with my work as an instructional coach, I got to see that in teachers. And so that is a breath of fresh air. This job's really hard. And so seeing teachers excited to do this work and to see the impact directly into their classroom and see students growing in the way that we want them to be, and not just feeling stuck and throwing our hands up and saying, I don't know, it's supposed to work. But being able to see the results, it's just been really so fun and just super motivating. Especially, new teachers, a lot of new teachers are coming into this profession. And it just makes sense to have all of that aligned because then we're speaking the same language all day long, all of us too, So I just think the whole experience was motivating, lots of clarity. It's just been great work that we're doing.
Thank you all so much. This is our last question before we turn to audience Q&A, but would love for you each super briefly to just name, like, if you were a district leader or a school leader or coach, right, who felt overwhelmed or didn't know where to start, like, what's the one decision that mattered most? Like, where would you tell people to start and focus their energy to do this work? Erin, why don't we start with you?
I think that one of the ways in which I felt empowered to do this work across the district this year, based on just our experience within the research study, was by leaning in and truly investigating the student experience. So my advice to a district leader would be get proximate to instruction in tier one and in support services. And don't look through the lens of what the teacher is doing per se, but look through the lens of what that student is experiencing. And ground your decision making based on the student experience and what you want for them.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm going to say, similarly, I think we're here for the students, what's happening with them, and that's the whole point of this. So if we're not seeing that joy and that excitement and that growth, then we're doing something wrong. And so I think it is hard work, but it gets easier. You make mistakes, but you're making the right mistakes this time that feel good. And typically when you're overwhelmed, you have the people that you work with, and again, look at the kids that are sitting in front of you. What do they need, and am I doing what they need today? And when you start seeing that growth and you start seeing that excitement, I've said it before, but it motivates you so much to keep going. And for us here at the school, it was really eye-opening to the work that we are able to do now, by having this coherent piece.
And I'm gonna cheat a little bit and say two things. I'm gonna piggyback what Erin said and get proximate to the student experience, but literally follow a student around for a day, a student who is in intervention or gets special education supports, right, or tutoring, and see what their experience is actually like as they go from tier one to intervention to tutoring. How connected or disconnected are those things? I think it'll be pretty eye-opening. And the second thing I would say for a district leader is just like catalog all the programs that you are using across different spaces, all the assessments, all the curricular materials. And I think it'll be really eye-opening, just the volume of different things that are being used and being thrown at kids. And it becomes very clear very quickly that we are really asking our highest need kids to make sense of some very disjointed experiences.
Thanks, y'all. We are going to turn now to some questions from the audience. We have about 13 minutes left. Thank you so much for the questions that you all have put in the Q&A. Our team on the back end is chatting and saying like they're coming faster than we can get them answered. So we have pulled out a couple that we'll ask of the panel, but please rest assured when we send out the recording, when we send the deck, we will answer the questions that are in the Q&A. So you all will get your questions answered, even if we don't have time to get them answered in this portion and while we're all on the call together. Y'all, lots of questions. Nick, it was a good segue, this like number of materials. We had lots of questions come in about the instructional materials alignment. And, I think this question is really like when we say use aligned high quality instructional materials across all supports. Does that mean everything has to be from the exact same publisher? Could you do some of that alignment work sort of in-house? Erin, Amy, if you would answer, let us know what y'all did. And then Nick would love to also get your perspective on like some of the different ways we're seeing this play out nationally.
Yeah, so as a district, we leaned into what we had as our tier one high quality instructional material. And so when we did some investigating, we learned that our particular tier one material also had supporting resources for tier two and tier three intervention that systematically aligned to our scope and sequence. Also, same visuals, same instructional routines, all those things were aligned. And so we made additional purchase of those materials to have that aligned resource. However, I've spoken with Devon and Nick, and Amy's heard me say this too, is if we were to do this again, how might we elevate the resources within the tier one HQIM to dip into that tier two space and allow that space to be a preview or a review, an additional access point, if you will, or additional attempt to gain mastery of tier one learning. Our tier one HQIM came with intervention components, but it also has just this wide breadth and depth of resources that, to Amy's point, time is so limited. Teachers just don't have the time to dig in and know where all of it is. So as a district, our ELA department has been intentional about digging in and highlighting specific aspects in tier one that could be utilized beyond the tier one setting.
You want to jump in with some other things we've
Yeah, I mean, I think what Erin highlighted there is really important. In general, I think if districts have high quality instructional materials in tier one, they should really think about how they can leverage either, as Erin said, the tier one materials themselves, or if they do have aligned intervention resources, I think that is really the ideal state. You could think about trying to like create an aligned program from something else. That is very hard to do because those materials follow, right, different scope and sequences of learning. They use different routines, terms, vocabulary, language. And so it just becomes really challenging to do it well. And I think, Erin highlighted at the top of the briefing how what they had before was good, high quality stuff. But because it didn't align, they just weren't seeing the bang for the buck that they would have wanted and expected to get. So it's really hard to do that well.
Yeah. We say the same thing often, right, about high quality instructional materials in core, which is like you could go it alone and try to get to consistency, right, with something that you're building in-house. But there's a cost benefit analysis there, right? Where are you spending your time and resources, and is that really the place you want to be doing that? Super helpful. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, both about like what support did you provide staff ahead of sort of sharing this, like the redesigned system with them, the new materials? So like what was the sort of initial onboarding support? And then there's also this question, Amy, I think mostly for you, about like who took the lead on this at the school level, and what did collaboration look like? So I think both the like what was the initial work that y'all did to sort of soften the ground, and then what were some of the sort of mechanisms that made this work in schools?
So initially, when we wanted to do this work, within the district partnership for research, I'll say, I created a video and a PowerPoint for our schools to use on site to explain coherence, what our goal was, what we were hoping to learn throughout the process. The materials had been purchased the year prior, and so getting people into those materials was a slow process. I will say we learned a lot from doing things poorly at the beginning, and we would fix a whole lot we are fixing a whole lot moving forward as we scale this work across all of our schools. So being more intentional about summer training opportunities, being more intentional about showing the ways in which these materials are coherent, and really labeling those things for people so that it's not a question mark they have to answer on their own. They are getting that guidance and support initially. And then I'll let Amy lean into that school level part.
Yeah, at the school level, it really started with our admin team first. We had to do a little bit of learning. So we, went with the district and kind of learned, how do we assess students with these new programs? What is that going to look like? We got our hands in the intervention materials and saw how they kind of align to what we would typically call tier 2 or tier 3. And we kind of made a plan of, we're just going to jump in and try it and see what happens. And so we have another coach here, and it was her first year last year. And I was like, here we go. So we jumped in and we looked at all the materials, and we started ourselves looking at the data and using it ourselves first, because I didn't really feel comfortable just asking teachers to do something I had no clue, what was going on. So we did a lot of it at the beginning, and then we kind of baby stepped it out. And here at our school, our teachers, they were more than willing. They were happy. Again, change is hard, and we don't have time, and it's tough during the day, but we knew we were doing the right work. So we started looking at that data, and then from there we started grouping kids. Okay, so we've got a group of kids in second grade, and they are still at CVC words. So what are we going to do with them? So then we would look at our intervention materials and kind of see, where are they going to fall? What instruction do they need? And then we pulled a lot of our PLC time. It did take a lot of PLC time, but again, it was actually great because not only were we teaching and even myself learning on how to use these materials, but we were building our content knowledge like crazy. I mean, as a coach, I was able to weave in so much content knowledge for our teachers. And that was a big boom for us, just here instructionally. Our teachers enjoyed it because a lot of the curriculum and stuff, because it was aligned, it was going straight in what they were doing in the classroom anyway. The unit topics, the stories. Oh, we just read a story that goes with this. They'll love that, So a lot of light bulb moments went off for us, but we did have to start with our admin team, but we baby stepped it out, and now we're fully rolling. And it makes sense, and teachers are starting to take the lead on some things, and It's not all of our PLC time now. So yeah.
It's super helpful, Amy. All right, y'all, we are getting towards the end of our time. There were a lot of questions about secondary literacy, math. How does this lay out in other content areas? A couple of things that I'll just voice over before I toss this one to the panel. TNTP is currently working on doing some research on this topic in math. It will be happening this spring, and we will be releasing a publication this summer that will dig into some of the concepts of coherence in the math content area. And then very similarly, sort of on the heels of that, are going to be digging in around secondary literacy. We know that this gets much more complex when we move out of the realm of foundational skills. And one of the things that I would name is identifying, right, what is the first point of need for a secondary student in literacy is really the most critical component. That is complex. And all too often, we see students in secondary interventions who are receiving supports either for comprehension or for foundational skills, when what they actually might need, right, is the opposite. But because the screening instruments and the assessment instruments are not, right, like sort of as precise as we need them to be, we're sort of losing kids, right, in that initial piece of the work. So just wanted to voice that over. There's more coming on those content areas, but would love, Nick, if you want to share, like, nationally, some of the things we're thinking and seeing, and certainly Erin and Amy, if you guys are thinking about this in Knox as well.
Yeah, real quickly, I can just share. I mean, Devon, you outlined some of this already. It gets more complex as you move up in grade levels, right? Comprehension is challenging. You have to figure out, do kids have comprehension gaps or fluency gaps or decoding gaps? And so you sort of have to have a diagnostic flow that can drill down and home in on the specific gap students have. In secondary literacy, most kids, not all kids, but most kids will have basic decoding down, but might struggle, right, with multisyllabic word decoding, with fluency, and then certainly with background knowledge and vocabulary. And so when we think about coherence for secondary literacy, we really want to think about making sure we are using intervention to prepare kids for what they're going to need to know to be able to access tier one text, right? So building that background knowledge, vocabulary for what they're going to see next week in their unit or their text, while also weaving in some of that fluency and multisyllabic word instruction, right? In math, kind of similar idea. We have to identify what are the key prerequisite skills students have to understand to be able to engage with upcoming tier one content, and then use that intervention time to really make sure students are solid in that foundation so they can actually go and engage in that content during tier one. So that's a very grossly simplified overview of it, but those are kind of the highlights I would pull out for folks.
Thanks, Nick.
I think for us in Knox County, one of the things that we're digging into is broadening this into the math space. However, what I will say is that we're really digging in by thinking about, if our youngest students start their educational career with a coherent learning experience and we roll that up in cohorts, what might that look like for kids long term? And so if our kindergarten students enter in and they are receiving instructionally coherent teaching and learning in all support areas in literacy and in math, will we avoid gap development? Will we see a decrease in students who are referred for special education? Will we see a decrease in students who score below the 40th percentile on a universal reading screener? And will we see an increase of students who are proficient on that third grade reading assessment? So we're building up from our kindergarten cohort on, and doing that widespread across our district, and then thinking about those implications in both math and literacy moving forward.
And I will say, my teachers have already asked, when are we doing this in math? We're ready, because they're so excited. And knowing that our district is going that way a little bit, I did kind of preview that a little bit, and I had teachers cheer, no joke. They're so excited. They've seen the power of it in ELA. So they're ready for math. They're really ready to go. So,
well, I think that's a beautiful point to end on. Y'all, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and work with us. Those of you in the audience, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. We know your time is precious. We will send a recording of the webinar along with the slide deck soon, and those additional FAQ questions. After the webinar ends, you will automatically receive a survey. Please take it. It helps us to ensure that we're bringing the most relevant information to the field. And the QR code on the the screen will take you to a page where you can sign up if you want to hear more about our support of instructional coherence or any academics, instruction, or staffing work. And we'll get you connected with a regional team member that'll help you learn more. So thanks again. We deeply appreciate your time. Have a great rest of your day.